Gentleman from Fairfax, Mr. Keam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaking in favor of the bill.
Gentleman has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen of the House, as I start my 5th year in the General Assembly, I've learned that there are some bills that you just don't anticipate being either controversial or grabbing headlines when you come down here, but through the process of subcommittee meetings and committee meetings and as members and constituents come down to the General Assembly, we learn about the importance of certain issues. And I think it's both an educational opportunity for us as members of the General Assembly to learn about different aspects of Virginia life. And I certainly learn a lot every single year that I'm down here of issues that I don't deal with on a daily basis, like, for example, agriculture or other fields. But it's also an opportunity for us as leaders of this Commonwealth to shed a light on a growing population and certain issues that impact them in ways that might not impact your constituencies, but are also important issues. And so this bill, House Bill 11, is one that gives us that opportunity. And for many members who've voted for or against this already in the House or have been following the debate, I think you know what the issues are. And I certainly respect and echo what Delegate Hugo just said about the specific substantive reasons why this bill is important. And I'm very supportive of what the patron has done, and I'm proud to be his chief co-patron. So I want to thank him for his support and leadership on this. But if I may just take just a couple minutes of your time and share a different perspective on this, which adds to, hopefully, the educational opportunity here, as well as to understand why this bill is rightfully in front of us. And no disrespect to my friends who consider this to be a bad precedent setting. I actually think this is a good precedent setting, because this bill allows us to do exactly what the General Assembly is designed to do, which is, as elected leaders, to represent the interests of our constituents and to reflect their priorities in a way that we bring a democratic process here to debate issues, find out where people stand, and then to let the chips fall where it may. And on this particular issue, I think there's a more important aspect of democracy that's at play here. Because you see, 104 years ago, in the year 1910, in the nation of Korea, which at that time was not divided, a horrible, tragic, historic circumstance happened. The Empire of Japan invaded and annexed that nation. And to do so, they crossed a body of water between the two nations, which we now are talking about in this bill. And when the Japanese came to annex that nation of Korea, they did so with brute and aggression and oppression and cruelty unmatched in the history of our nation, in the history of our world. Now, there are plenty of other countries that have gone through conflicts. There are plenty of other nations that have had historic conflicts and wars, and you can't say one is worse or better than the other. But for the people who were oppressed, the millions of Koreans who had to live under the oppression for 35 years, that is a period that they just cannot forget. They cannot sweep away under the history. From 1910 until 1945, for those 35 years, all the Korean men and women and children who were born and who were living in that time went through suffering and disgrace and humility that a lot of other nations didn't have to face. Two of those people were my parents. And I dare say many of the people in our audience today and in House Room 3 who are listening and those maybe watching, they probably went through those experiences as well. And my mother, who's in her late 70s now, never talks about that period in her life. Because to this day, it aggravates her. To this day, it boils up emotions that she had locked away for 50 years. To this day, she doesn't want to think about the pain and the torture that she had to go through. Because as a young child who enrolled in school during the Japanese annexation, she was not allowed to use her given name that her father, my grandfather, gave her. She had to use a Japanese name. The time that she spent in school, in a classroom, instead of having a teacher in front of her, she had a police officer with a longsword standing in front of her. Instead of using the language that she was so proud to call her own, Hangul, she had to learn and speak Japanese. And to this day, when she's at the grocery store or at a restaurant, when she's trying to do quick math, she recites the multiplication numbers in Japanese, because that's how she was memorized to learn, and not using her own native language of Korean. And she is not alone. There are millions and millions of Korean Americans all around the country, including here in Virginia, who've gone through that same experience. And so, after the end of that war, August 15th of 1945, what we in America celebrate as VJ Day, Victory over Japan. August 15th of 1945 is also Independence Day for Korea. because that was the day that the first time in the Korean people's history of 5,000 years, they discovered and realized an independence and freedom and civil liberties that they've never felt during those 35 years. And it was the first time in their history where they were annexed by another nation. And so from the day that they became independent in August of 1945, they vowed, as a proud people, that they will never let anybody else ever oppress them again. And they also vowed that as a nation, they'll be more economically powerful so that they can compete with anybody else in the world. And so in 1950, when the war broke out again, with thanks to the Americans who came to save that nation and the 36,000 Americans who sacrificed their lives, they fought back for the ideals of democracy and freedom that this nation stands for. And to this day, that piece of land in the southern peninsula of Korea is the only piece of land in that region that is a true democracy that strives its best to be the strongest partner for American military interests. And since then, in the 1960s and the 70s, when the communists was taking over Southeast Asia, Koreans were the first nation to step up and join the United Nations and Americans to fight back against the domino theory, because they know what it's like to be under a repressive regime of communism and fascism. And that's why in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s, Koreans left their home country looking for better opportunities so that their children will never have to face that kind of oppression. And that's why people like me were able to come to the United States as a teenager to be able to live out my life here in America, to live the American dream that I would not have had the chance to do so had my parents stayed in Korea. And that is why, ladies and gentlemen of the House, when they opened up the textbooks of their children and they saw that a map that reminds them of that oppression, that reminds them of the invasion, that reminds them of that body of water that was crossed by the Japanese to come and annex that nation for 35 years, when they saw that name designated in a way that brings back those historic inaccuracies, when that nation has fought for the last 45, 50 years to try to correct that history, they realized that the best thing that they could do is ask for a redress of this body here. That is why this bill is in front of us. The hundreds and thousands of Korean Americans who petitioned you to ask for your help, to come and ask for your relief, they are exercising their First Amendment freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to bring their grievance to the government, some things, those freedoms that they were never able to exercise when they were living under an oppressive regime. So, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House, this bill is about a very simple change, which is to ask for the textbooks in Virginia going forward, no fiscal impact, going forward, to be purchased that has the accurate double name. That's all it is. But beyond that, Mr. Speaker, this bill is a symbolic beginning of what the gentleman from Powhatan mentioned in his eloquent speech today about the America that we all want. The America of Reverend Martin Luther King. The America where race doesn't matter anymore. Ethnic backgrounds and our divisions should not be a factor. But we can't get there if people are still holding on to fears and oppressions from a bygone era. And they can't get there unless they feel open enough to be able to come to a place like this, speak out, to speak their mind, ask for redress in this government. And if we can provide them with that kind of relief, that's one step towards them becoming fuller, more active, civic-minded Americans and Virginians. And that is why this bill is so important to the men and women who have gathered here today. And that's why I urge that you help us pass this bill today. Thank you.